Back in November 1993, the first UFC tournament took place 30 years. This is a huge distance that is not covered in one video. We begin the cycle video dedicated to the anniversary of our beloved organization. We will tell you about 30 years and 30 fighters who wrote UFC history today. Next in line are the top 10 pioneers from MMA. It is impossible to imagine getting started time machine and go forward to 30 years ago. Roice Graice. The Gracies clan has made a name for itself by challenging fighters around the world. The Brazilians went up against karatekas and judo fighters to assert the superiority of their style. In the 70s, they reached the USA, but the country of freedom was already the mecca of professional boxing and, moreover, was experiencing a boom in martial arts. Towards the end of the 80s, Gracie was able to create an academy in the United States, continuing to challenge. Their fights were sold on videotapes in huge quantities. In the early 90s, entrepreneur Davie proposed to the Brazilians the idea of a purely cinematic tournament, in which there were 8 fighters and each represented their own style, and there were almost no rules. Gracie agreed. So on November 12, 1990, the epoch began. The still unknown Hughes spoke on behalf of the family, and this is his opponent, boxer Art Jisung, entered the fight wearing only one glove, although he didn't even have time to hit. Hughes does a double leg takedown, then sits on top, and after a short fuss, the American decides to give up. In the semifinals, heavyweight Ken Shamrock awaited Hughes. This big guy would make his presence known, but that day, he had no chance. From the other half of the bracket, Gerard Gordeau, a Dutch karateka who was presented as a savate fighter, advanced to the finals. He tried to grab onto the cage but still ended up on the floor and ended up in a chokehold. It must be said that the Americans then were the coolest people among boxers, wrestlers, and karatekas. And all of them were broken by a guy who didn't look heroic at all. Hughes would win 2 more tournaments and then head to Japan. And although the Gracie surname will quickly cease to inspire awe, without this family there would be no UFC. And without Hughes, the very first tournament could have been the last. The Brazilian literally showed the beauty of MMA to the Americans. Thanks to him, a one-time commercial turned into a promotion, and jiu-jitsu became the most popular rowing base. And Hughes did all this in 1993. Ken Shamrock. 1994. The whole planet dances to Ace of Base, and the Japanese release PlayStation. Schumacher is rushing to his first championship, and Ken Shamrock is preparing for revenge. Gracie and Shamrock are antipodes in many ways. Ken grew up in a dysfunctional family, wandered and ruined his life. No one laid out the red carpet for him. When Ken went to Japan and became one of the pioneers of MMA. In '94, Ken turned 30 and was ready to tear everyone apart at UFC 3. The first opponent was Christoph Leninger, a member of the US judo team. Clinch and Shamrock is on top. The opponent attacks and tries to apply a painful hold. Leninger decides to give up. Felix Mitchell was presented as an expert in Shaolin Kung Fu, although the skills of Eastern masters against trivial struggles did not help. Mitchell whirled in his arms until he was strangled. Hughes started in the other half of the bracket, and the first fight with the crazy Chemo Leopoldo completely exhausted him. The Brazilians didn't like to take risks, so Gracie didn't make it to the semifinals. Having learned about this, Shamrock also withdrew and did not care about the title and money. This only added interest to the rematch that took place at UFC 5 and showed all the problems of the young sport. For 36 minutes, the fighters fumbled on the floor, unable to inflict damage on each other, and the result was a draw. After time expires, Shamrock will still have victories. He will win the Super Fight title but will soon leave for WWE, and with him, the era of old-school tournaments. And yet, in 1994, he proved that a fighter can be a true professional, athletic, eloquent, and most importantly, ready to devote himself entirely to fights. That's when the viewer understood MMA. It was serious, and for the long haul. Dan Severn. He knew how to fight in MMA. That's already half the success. In addition, he was huge and damn strong. Somewhere in the mid-90s, he looked more like a circus wrestler from somewhere at the beginning of the century. His first tournament ended in defeat in a difficult fight with Roice Graice. But in April '95, the Beast returned to claim what was his. To begin with, he smeared Joe Charles on the canvas. In the semifinals, the beginner Oleg Taktarov tried to stop him. But Severn broke his forehead with his knee, and the fight was stopped. And a tournament was ended with brutal Americana on Dave Beneteau. In December of the same year, the UFC decided to gather its elite at the Ultimate Tournament. The rules of fighting have evolved, judges have appeared, and time limits have been reduced. Severn finished the first battle quickly. But in the fight with Tankabot, he had to work hard. The fat man in the gloves we knew did not want to give up, and the Beast chopped him down on the floor until the end of the round. In the finale, Taktarov wanted to get even with him. The Sambist threatened with a painful hold, but the wrestler maintained control from above. In addition, Oleg was bleeding again, and the Beast did not allow him to rise. Taktarov still got up and even tried to fight. The next time they were separated by McCarthy. And at the end, the judges added 3 minutes to extend this spectacle. After half an hour of struggle, the Beast, the best in '95, celebrated victory. Thanks to Severn, in '95, it became clear that it was not the insidious jiu-jitsu that would dominate in the cage, but old-school wrestling. And although he will fight more than 100 fights, he will never become a full-fledged MMA fighter, but will always remain faithful to his native sport. Mark Coleman. 1996 would be a turning point for the UFC, and the slogan, "No rounds, no rules," would become a thing of the past. It's February, things are going great. The UFC is holding its first show in Puerto Rico. Gary Goodridge delivered his legendary knockout and then lost to the equally legendary Don Frye. It was the UFC's most commercially successful event. But along with success came the attention of big politics. Soon, Senator John McCain will launch a campaign against the UFC, which will result in the promotion being banned in 36 states and the loss of all major cable networks. In the midst of a protest campaign, Mark Coleman will make his debut at UFC 10. He knew how not only to take his opponents to the ground, but also to effectively win there. Gary Goodridge tested this technique on himself. The Big Daddy knew how to defend himself, but he couldn't escape. He even tried to find a way out somewhere in the cage, but the door was treacherously closed. And on the ground, he decided not to wait for Mark Coleman to shoot him with punches and tapped the canvas. In the finals of the tournament, Mark Coleman will face a mustachioed mountain of muscles and charisma named Don Frye. Bruce Buffer announces the fighters. Frye blocks double leg and immediately gives up the position. Coleman smashes him to the ground, but makes a mistake himself. Frye reciprocated with an attempt at a takedown, and Mark continued to shoot. But the mustachioed predator fought. And now, he can't defend against a throw like that. Street boxing from Coleman. Frye's powers are gone, and McCarthy stops the beating. Mark received the nickname Hammer and is considered the father of the ground and pound style. True, he was not the first to start hitting his opponents from above, but it was Coleman who turned it into a system. 2 months later, Coleman would win the UFC 11 tournament in just over 3 minutes. Then, he will have the chance to play for the first ever UFC regular champion title, and the opponent was not a weak one. Den did not change his style, but Mark fought just as well and could even do damage while standing. An unsuccessful double leg ruined Severn's chances. Coleman forced him to surrender. It was a victory of mixed style over naked wrestling. Mark Coleman will become a real legend in the Pride, breaking the great series of Igor Vovchanchin. But it was in 1996 that he changed MMA forever. Randy Couture. In 1997, Mike Tyson bit off Evander Holyfield's ear and was left out of boxing for a year. They tried to lure him into the UFC, but, of course, without success. Britain returns Hong Kong to China, Princess Diana dies, and the Titanic tears apart cinemas. The UFC is entering an era of great change. At tournament number 12, weight categories appeared. Before the 14th tournament, fighters were required to wear gloves, and finishing kicks to the head were prohibited. And at UFC 13, Randy Couture made his debut. He was over 30 years old, had vast wrestling experience, and 3 calls to the Olympic team, but each time as a reserve. There were 3 weeks left before the tournament, and there was no fighter, someone called Couture, and he immediately agreed. The first was Tony Halma. He easily knocked him down and forced him to surrender within a minute. Next up is poor Stephen Graham. Wrestler wiped his on the ground. So, Randy won UFC 13. Then, the company held 2 or 3 Grand Prix per evening, reducing the number of participants to 4. But most of the old stars had already left the promotion, and the format was dying. At UFC 15, Couture received a contenders fight against 20-year-old Vitor Belfort. The Brazilian tore Randy's shorts. Couture showed Belfort a masterclass in wrestling, and in the stand-up, the American used the legendary dirty boxing and left no chance on the ground. December came. Couture and the UFC went to Japan for the first show outside the United States, where Randy became the headliner. He made Maurice Smith suffer for 20 minutes in order to leave the islands with the champion belt. And this is not his last title. He is the only 4-time UFC champion, 3-time heavyweight champion, the first champion in 2 weight categories, the oldest title holder, and simply the person who knew best how to come back after defeat. And the path of the legend began in 1997. Frank Shamrock. Frank and Ken Shamrock are not siblings. They have the same adoptive father, but it was Ken who brought Frank into martial arts. Ken Shamrock is not only a UFC star, but also the founder of Pancrase. His half-brother started there, and although Frank fought well, Ken always saw him only second. But one day, everything changed. The UFC held a tournament in Japan and was looking for a local star to fight for the vacant title. Frank agreed to fight Olympic champion Kevin Jackson. Shamrock knew how to surprise. He became the light heavyweight champion in 16 seconds. And then defended the title in 22 by breaking the neck of Igor Zinoviev. In 98, he would perform at every UFC show. Jeremy Horm will be the first to seriously compete with him. He will pull Frank to the ground, but he himself will fall into a painful hold. In the fall, the UFC will travel to Brazil for the first time, where Shamrock will destroy John Lober. '98 was the best year for Frank Shamrock, but it was also a sad year. He quarreled with his brother, and their family paths diverged. He was also disappointed in the UFC, admitting that he did not see a future for the company. Shamrock enters the next fight, knowing that he will leave, and at the same time gave out 4 rounds of war against Tito Ortiz. The California bully pressed him with his power, but the champion controlled the situation. Ortiz on top couldn't do anything but was pretty tired, and Shamrock felt it. A few blows were enough for Tito to give up. And then the champion announced his retirement. Finding himself in the UFC at the crossroads of eras, Shamrock produces a wow factor. Such a combination of skill and physical form had never been seen before in the cage. 98th was the key year of his career. And Frank himself helped the company stay afloat. And although he will return more than once, nothing better will happen to him. In the year when Americans expected the end of the world, the real monster caused Armageddon. Kevin Rendelman became a star back in collegiate wrestling. He got into MMA by accident. Mark Coleman invited him to fight in Brazil. When Kevin signed a contract with the UFC, there were practically no other fighters on the contract, so he only needed one victory to get a title shot. Bas Rutten was also a star, but in MMA. And although the American audience did not yet know him, the company clearly expected a lot from the Dutchman. He and Kevin fought for the title in May 1999, and the monster, of course, turned on the fight. From above, he did not work as well as Coleman, but he maintained control over his opponent. And already in the first round, he severely smashed Rutten's face. This continued in the second and third rounds, although the monster became more and more passive, and Bas, on the contrary, became bolder, hitting from below. In those days, judges did not give marks yet, but simply announced the name of the winner, and that day, the Dutchman became it. The public was dissatisfied with the judge's decision, so the UFC soon changed the judging by copying the scoring system for each round from boxing. Rutten will soon retire, and Kevin will take his Pete Williams bust belt. And although he won't be champion for long, the monster will remain the biggest revelation of 1999. Tito Ortiz. 2000, UFC is on the verge of bankruptcy. There is not enough money even to release videotapes, but there is also a positive trend thanks to the efforts of John McCarthy and Sports Commissioner Jeff Blatnick. California is adopting uniform MMA rules, with other states soon to follow. But most importantly, the UFC had loyal fighters. Tito Ortiz began his career back in 1997. Now he was going to make UFC history again. In Japan, Tito fights for the vacant title against Wanderlei Silva. The Brazilian fought poorly in his best years, and in that fight, he spent the entire fight under the covers. In the third round, he caught the American. But he saved himself by wrestling. A boring victory, but Tito did not chase people's love. He redeemed himself by quickly pinning Yuki Kondo, and then defended the title 4 more times, finally giving it real significance. Ortiz enjoyed playing the villain. His colleagues didn't like him, Dana White hated him, but the public was willing to pay to see a bully get his ass kicked. Ortiz's fight with Ken Shamrock made fans believe in the promotion again. Tito will continue to fight the best heavyweights in the world and set several more box office records. And although he has few fans, we must note that Ortiz stayed with the company during the most difficult times and carried it on his shoulders when the UFC needed a strong champion. If he had not won the title in 2000, MMA history might have turned out differently. Matt Hughes. In January 2001, the UFC was sold to the Fertitta brothers, Las Vegas casino owners. Their school friend Dana White became the new president of the company. Thus began the next era in the history of the promotion. And each era, as you know, has its heroes. Matt Hughes was a machine. At the beginning of his career, he could carry out 10 fights per year, sometimes looking into the UFC. In 2001, he was hooked with the offer of a fight against Carlos Newton. And besides, they had personal scores to settle. The Canadian took the belt from Pat Miletich, Hughes' trainer. Newton believed in the power of his jiu-jitsu, but the American ate black belts for breakfast. Guillotine attempt. Although it didn't work out, Hughes didn't give up the initiative. Newton threw a triangle. Hughes solved the problem radically. Matt would rule the middleweight division until Georges St-Pierre arrived. He dominated the best fighters on the planet, but remained a simple American who lives on a farm, sinks cars in the mud, and loves fishing. Perhaps this is exactly the kind of champion that was needed in the tragic 2001 for America. Rico Rodriguez. Rico Rodriguez is a rare example of a fighter of those years who first earned a name in the Pride and only then landed in the UFC. And he walked in by kicking the door. He was young, had a strong background in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and won an ADCC tournament under his belt. In January 2002, he scored against the seemingly impenetrable Jeff Monson. And in May, Tsuyoshi Kasaka became his victim. Rodriguez had a chance to end the year with a title fight against Randy Couture. The veteran had already lost it to Josh Barnett, but he failed a doping test and went to Japan. Now Randy was trying to stop another young beast and looked good. But it was difficult even for him to fight with a hefty black belt. A little in the rack. And Randy goes to fight from below. Rico defended himself well, but the veteran lost strength in the later rounds. This took its toll. A couple of good elbow strikes, and the referee hurries to stop the fight. Beyond the bright side, sport also has a dark side. The young talent was on drugs and quickly derailed his career. He will trade his name in the minor leagues for years and then be forgotten. This was the first decade of the UFC. The company has gone from a crazy tournament of fighting without rules to a full-fledged sports league, which has won its right to exist. Many fighters of that time are considered legends. Others have sunk into oblivion, but they all gave impetus to the sport that we love. Friends, thank you for watching. Write in the comments, which of the 10 heroes of this decade made the greatest contribution to the development of the promotion? Well, if you liked the video, feel free to like it and don't forget to subscribe because the second part will be out soon.